I think it's one of the things that Orwell, it's a long history of trying to convince, there is a long history of trying to convince people of this. You know, it's an interesting fact that the concept of unemployment as something that isn't just sort of shiftless people who don't want to work, just idleness, but something that happens in society, something that inevitably happens, that jobs won't be created so that 100% of people have work, was actually sort of invented in the 1890s. Economists came around and suddenly figured this thing out. And I think this book, The Road to Wigan Pier, and other Orwell writings, is part of the long struggle to get people to acknowledge that unemployed people, I mean, it seems like a very simple thing to many of us to understand this, that people become unemployed not simply because they're lazy or don't want to work, but because of structural factors like, you know, mines go out of, you know, they don't make as much coal in the summer as they do in the winter, in this case. And I think Orwell's book is yet another moment, and, you know, still today we have these discussions about whether unemployment is something that happens naturally in our society or whether it's because of personal morality, you know, that sort of thing.
I'm wondering, this sort of makes me think about the question that I asked about whether the gap is widening between the poor and the rich. And Quentin said something to me the other day that's quite interesting about how a lot of the kids that he's working with sort of look at these living in council estates next to these high-rise penthouses, and there's this aspiration of wanting more because people have more, and I think that could be quite relevant.
Yeah, I think a lot of young people that we are seeing in the media as, maybe I'm jumping the gun, but as gang members or maybe thugs or ASBO kids, they're just, a lot of them that we work with, when you really get to the grassroots of it, they're just young kids that's trying to provide for the home. Because if you've got a parent that was in a good job in the city, had a house and mortgage, had a nice 4x4 outside, and then after 20 years you're then made redundant, everything has to go back. The house has to go back, the car has to go back. Maybe the 3 kids in university have to leave. And when you look at that and you've got a young sibling within that household, thinking, okay, I could get on the train, let's say Lichfield, because we don't want them coming up here. Get on the train to Lichfield or somewhere outside of London. And within that train journey, they make £500 to £1,000 a week. A lot of parents are going to turn a blind eye to that because they need to pay the mortgage. So then, if we are not looking at that as a state of poverty because the family are maintaining the 4x4 and the house or mortgage, it then goes unmeasured because we're thinking that family is doing okay. They're in a privileged area and they're still maintaining, when really there's a young sibling within that household that's actually covering the patches. And that's what we have to look at when we're talking about measuring poverty. A lot of people are in poverty, but they're actually covering the cracks so no one would be able to measure them.
Probably, of course, I've got a lot of stuff on this, but certainly your life, you live a longer life the richer you are in the UK. If you live in Kensington, Chelsea, you live on average 10 to 15 years longer than someone who lives in a poor area. If you look at Speke in Liverpool, another garden city, if you live on one side of the road, you live 10 years longer than if you live on the other side of the road. And I think the other thing about the rich and poor, and exactly what Brendan's saying about the people living side by side, this isn't me. This is someone published this on the 22nd of August 2011, just after the riots. He wrote, "The direct promotion of products and services is nothing new, of course, other than its relentlessly growing scale. The more insidious dimension of the promotion of consumerism lies in its largely successful endeavour to capture lifestyle perceptions. Celebrities, be they sports stars, musicians, actors, or the legions of D-list celebs, are linked to compulsive consumption. You, young people, are told, ought to live like this. The second, flatly contradictory message is that you can't have it. For the average young person, celebrity-style conspicuous consumption is tantalisingly but almost entirely out of reach. For a young person growing up in a non-rich household, the message reinforced by peer pressure is a deeply contradictory blend of this is fulfilment and it will forever be out of your reach. You are, the message says, inadequate if you don't own product X, Y, or Z, but you are never going to own them. Compulsive consumerism knows few limits to the unattainable aspiration." And what's terrifying about that is the person who wrote it was Dr. Tim Morgan, head of research at the stockbroker, Tulip Freeborn, and he wrote it after the riots in one of the most revolutionary tracts I've ever seen, dismantling consumer society. It's called I Buy Therefore I Am, and I really recommend you read it. It's online. But that's how the city views the problem of the rich.
Well, then what's interesting is that Orwell takes up this and we heard a lot, especially after the riots last year, about the question of consumerism and the role that it plays in that sort of thing, and in all sorts of things. But what's interesting is that Orwell takes up this question. I'm sorry to keep bringing it. I mean, maybe I shouldn't apologize. It's an Orwell event, isn't it? But Orwell takes up. I reread the book in the last couple of days because I hadn't read it in a little while, and it is fascinating how sort of prescient and sort of on topic he is. He takes up the question. What he's so good at is taking up the questions that sort of hover around in all of our minds, get expressed in newspaper opinion columns and on TV and on talk radio, right? These very sort of everyday objections to things that happen politically, where he takes on the question, for instance, he admits all miners have access to a radio. This is in 1937. So, they may not have food, or, they may not have the housing that they need. Their housing may be horribly crappy. But on the other hand, they might all have a radio, and he takes on the question of, what does it mean? What do we make of the fact that people will often choose cheap, as he calls them, cheap palliatives over, the things that one would expect somebody rationally to choose to live their life, to save their life, right? Why don't the poor just eat brown bread and healthy vegetables? Why do they want these other things? And what he comes up with, his turn on this is to say that, well, people do, right? If we're all, any of us are in a bad situation, if you've ever been in a bad situation, sometimes you choose the easy, palliative over the very heartful, whatever. But also that, people make money off of these things. It's no wonder that, people make money off of the radio. People make money off of these cheap, selling candy to people instead of rich brown bread for the poor to eat, right? So they're supposed to, but all I want to say is that what's interesting about it is he took up some questions that we saw batted around in the media all summer last summer during the riots. Lots of them are taken up in this book, way back in 1937, So.
What struck you reading this, Jacqueline, when you came to this, looking at what you do and what you see every day? How relevant is it today?
The voting here?
Yes.
I think that what struck me is that a lot remains the same, but there are lots of new features to poverty. We've got trafficking, we've got sexual exploitation of young people, we've got the gangs and the knife crimes. So there's lots of the same, but there's these new and emerging things, and it's how we deal with them. And I think the important thing for me is about giving voice to these people so they can say, look, this is our life, and these are our lives, and this is how we deal with it, and this is what we need. So I think it's important to give disadvantaged people a platform so we can hear from them. I think that's why Brenton's book is really important. We're hearing it direct, from them.
And do you mind telling us about what you've been doing this for 16 years, about the kids that you work with, and how they overcome this, and whether you think that it is getting harder, or...
Yes, one of the things we do, we run lots of workshops for young people to enable them, to give them voice, life writing workshops, drama workshops, and the message is coming loud and clear from young people. One is that they're afraid, and I think Orwell says, that one of the things about poverty is that it annihilates the future, and this is the message that's coming from young people. They cannot see a future for themselves. They just take each day as it comes, and I think that's one of the most worrying things. They are not stakeholders, that they don't feel that they're stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.